So again, the idea is that we're comparing motivational interviewing as a style for guiding patients rather than directing or telling patients what to do. Now what you see on the slide to get us started is an example of directing. So I'm going to read this slide with you. You can see the healthcare professional speaking to his patients starts by saying, "Well, Mr. Smith, your A1C result shows that the level of glucose in your blood are raised today. This means that you really need to watch your diet. Have you thought about adjusting this?" And the patient, as you can see, responds, "Well, it's not that easy. Yeah, I've tried, but you know what it's like. I mean, it's not so easy with my job, driving around in a rush, and you just have to grab some food at lunch and keep going." The healthcare professional responds, "Well, you know what you could do? You could bring your own lunch with you," says the patient. I could do that, but it's so busy in the morning, just getting us all out of the house, and then I stop in a cafe anyway at lunch. So I would, then I have to avoid the easy option of just getting a roll and feeling full and ready for action." Again, the professional responds, "Well, my advice to you is to treat this as your top priority." Again, the directing style, it comes easy to all of us, but the problem is we haven't engaged our patient. It's unlikely that patient's going to leave the office and be interested and willing to go along with that, because we really haven't addressed his issues and haven't involved him as a co-equal, and we haven't made use of his expertise in his own life. So on the next slide, let's switch that and now look at what a guiding strategy looks like. And again, this is the heart and soul of a motivational interviewing approach. Says the professional, Mr. Smith, your A1C is high today. I wonder what you make of this." Says the patient, "Well, I don't know. I'm not surprised because it's hard enough getting by day to day without worrying about this as well." Says the professional, "Well, everyday life can't stop because you have diabetes." "Yes," says the patient, "exactly, but I know I do need to be careful." "Really? In what way?" says the professional. "Well, I need to watch my diet and get more exercise. I know that, but it's not so easy." Responds the HCP, "Well, what, if anything, might be manageable for you right now?" The patient responds, "Well, exercise, I guess, but don't expect great things from me." And responds the HCP, "Well, a change in diet or exercise will be a great help. How might you succeed with more exercise?" So I think you can get a flavor as you look at this example that, again, it's not me just as a healthcare professional giving you advice, but again, joining with you for us to think together about how to move forward. Now let's break this down. You could see more what I mean by this and how this actually works. As we think about motivational interviewing, there's really 4 core strategies. The idea of expressing empathy, developing discrepancy, rolling with resistance, and supporting self-efficacy. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, these are illustrative examples of strategies we can use to make all of this work. We're going to walk through each of these one by one so you can get a sense of this. So first of all, we'll talk about expressing empathy. Again, the idea being, and you could see some of that in that guiding example that I just showed you, that our patients are like any of us, and we're more interested and willing to go along with suggestions if we get the sense that you, the healthcare professional, are on my side, that we're again working on this together. And that means being an attentive listener and using summary feedback to let the individual know that I've heard them. And at the heart of how to do that are the motivational interviewing skills, micro skills of what we call the OARs. Let me show you what the OARs look like on the next slide. Now the OARs, O-A-R-S, again very simply are this. It's developing the ability to use open-ended questions rather than closed questions, affirming statements or affirmative statements, reflections, and summaries or summarizing statements. And again, I want to explain how each of those might look. So first of all, when we talk about open-ended versus closed-ended questions, I bet you have a good idea what that looks like on the next, and you'll see some examples on the next slide. So very simply, if you say to someone, "How long have you had diabetes, Mr. Smith?" Clearly this is a closed-ended question. A closed-ended question simply means the answer is either going to be yes or no or a number. Second question, what's What's living with diabetes been like for you? Clearly this is an open-ended question. Mr. Jones, don't you care about your health? Again, you can see this is a closed-ended question. Finally, what possible complications of diabetes worry you the most? Open-ended question. Again, the idea, as healthcare professionals, because time is so limited, we're very used to getting specific information from our patients, so we tend to use closed-ended questions quite often. Now, as a result of that, our patients have gotten very, very good at being passive and being quiet because they know what's going to be asked for them. So there's often some discomfort, if we haven't done it before, of starting to use the open-ended question. There's often some fear of that on the part of the healthcare professional of, boy, if I start doing this, my patients will never stop talking, and it'll be a big problem. Won't be able to get out of here in time. It turns out that's really not a problem from the few studies that have been done to look at this specifically. But we'll be thinking about how to use those open-ended questions. Second part of the ORS, that's open-ended questions, is the A, affirmative statements or affirming statements. And you'll see that now on the next slide. I appreciate all the efforts you've made. Gee, Mr. Jones, no matter how tough it's been, you've never given up. Or, gosh, that's an excellent suggestion. Huh, I can see you're a strong person and that's helped you in many ways. Now, we want to be careful with affirming statements. We don't want to be corny. We don't want to be insincere in any way. But finding ways of positively reinforcing patients for what they're doing, what they're going through, is an effective way to begin to more easily engage with people. Again, this sense that we're on the same side, that it's not me versus you. And you can see how any of these affirming statements can be used. Just to give you an example, for example, the last statement on this slide was in response to someone saying to me, I'm not so sure I really want to take any additional medications. You know, it's my life. And rather than confronting the person with that, we'd start by saying, well, it's pretty clear you're a strong person, and that's helped you in many ways. And as we go on, I might point out to him that actually I'm not so sure it's going to help you in this particular situation right now. But we find ways of, again, of coming alongside our patients, that we're all in this together. So that's the A in the ORS. Now the R, probably the thing we use most commonly, are reflection statements. Now there's different kinds of reflection statements. We have limited time here today, so I wanted to point out some simple reflections. And simple reflections are simply when someone makes a statement to us, how do we respond in a way, not with a question, but some way of letting that person know that we have heard what they've said. So someone says to you, as you can see in this example, you know, I just don't want to take any pills. I should be able to manage diabetes on my own. And one effective reflection would be, so you don't want to rely on a pill. It seems to you like a crutch. Or you might say, so you're not so sure this approach can really help you to live a long and healthy life. Now, clearly we're not done. This is just a part of the process, but we're letting our patient know that we have heard what they've said. Doesn't mean we agree. Reflection statements are incredibly effective. I'll try to give you some examples as we go on. Now, the last part of the ORS, the S, has to do with summary statements. Now, summary statements are, well, kind of like a reflection, but bigger. It's taking a bigger chunk of what you have heard from the patient and summarizing that, usually in 3 to 4 sentences. At least that's typically how I've seen it done and how I do it. Now, we don't have to summarize everything we hear. We're taking little bits of what we hear and bringing them together into more of a coherent story that fits where we might want to go. So here's the example, and I'll read it with you. So, Mr. Smith, it sounds like from what you've told me, you're inclined in, well, 2 different directions. On the one hand, you're somewhat worried about the possible long-term effects of your diabetes. If you don't manage it well, you've told me about blindness, amputation, things like that. Those are distressing to think about. On the other hand, you're young and you feel fairly healthy most of the time. You enjoy eating what you like, and as you said, the long-term consequences seem far away. So you're concerned, and at the same time you're not concerned. Do I have that right? So again, I'm not confronting this individual. I'm just summarizing what I've heard, and I'm looking for the fact that they are feeling mixed about this idea of making a positive change. So those are the OARS, O-A-R-S, open-ended questions, affirmative statements, reflections, and summary statements. And we've talked a little bit about how we would use that to come alongside our patients, to deal with that first core strategy, which is expressing empathy. So if we go on, as you can see on the next slide, we'll look at developing discrepancy. Now, before I describe this, let me explain this if I can. Again, this lies at the heart of motivational interviewing. The idea that nobody's unmotivated to live a long and healthy life, but that odds are good our patients are, like us, ambivalent. And that rather than confronting that ambivalence, saying, I know you want to do this, but I'm telling you you should do it a different way, we actually make things a little worse, if you will. What we want to do, and you could see that in the last summary statement, is we want to point out that that individual actually is of two minds. That on the one hand they feel one way, on the other hand they feel the other way, and we actually may want to make that tension, that discrepancy, even bigger. So, there's a variety of ways of doing that. One way, probably the most common way in motivational interviewing, is using what's called the importance conversation. And you'll see an example of that on the next slide. So that means, let's say I'm talking to someone, we'll again use a simple name, maybe Mr. Brown, for example. And Mr. Brown and I have been talking about, oh gosh, the utility of, again, exercise is probably the most easiest thing to talk about. And Mr. Brown's always been interested, but really hasn't really included any kind of regular exercise in his life, at least not in the past few years. And again, rather than giving him advice about what to do and telling him about the fitness center down the road or etc., we want to prepare the soil. We want to find out how important this really is to him, and we want to use that to begin to clarify the fact that he is of two minds. The importance question, as you see written on this slide, is exactly the best way, and one of the ways in which we do that. So how do you feel about exercise now? And if 0 was not important and 10 was very important, what number would you give yourself? And I think it's very important actually usually to draw this on a piece of paper and put this in front of the individual before we actually ask the question. It's really nice to see it. And if we do it properly, odds are good the person's going to say some number that's, well, larger than 0. And as long as it's more than 0, then we can have an interesting conversation. We could start by saying, gee, I noticed you said 4. How come it's not lower than 4? How come it's not 3 or 2 or 1? And what we're asking Mr. Brown now to consider is for him to tell us what benefit does he see in this idea of regular exercise. I don't have to give him my 10 reasons why I think exercise is important. Let him convince himself. And it's powerful for him to hear it from his own ears. I might then say, gee, you said 4, how come it's not a little higher than 4, 5, or 6? And again, I'm asking him to consider what are the obstacles? What does he see that's in the way? And then I might also add a last question, which is, okay, you said your score is 4. Can you imagine anything about what would it possibly take for that important score to go from a 4 up to a 5 or 6 or 7? What would have to happen? Again, we're trying to make use of his expertise about his own life to consider what would need to occur, what strategies we would want to employ for him to begin to think of exercise as so worthwhile that he might be even more intrigued and interested in getting something started. Let me give you an example of that on the next slide.